Right. Good evening and welcome. My name is Alejandro Baer. I'm a faculty member in the Sociology Department and I direct the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Education as Reparative Justice, Rethinking Indigenous Representation in Curriculum and Museum Exhibits. I want to thank our speakers and partners in this event, Iyekiyapiwin Darlene St. Clair and Karine Duhamel, for sharing with us today their insight and experience on this subject. This program is part of a human rights lab project at the University of Minnesota that examines the following question, together with leaders and advocates in the field of education. How can education serve as or for reparative justice in settler colonial contexts? I want to thank the Human Rights Center and the Human Rights Program who administer the Human Rights Lab project, and of course the members of our team, George Dalbo, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction in the School of Education at the University of Minnesota, Gillian LaBranche, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology, and Joe Eggers, who is the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. There is no reparative justice without truth-telling. And our colleagues at the Department of American Indian Studies have a statement on their homepage, which we embrace as a team of faculty, staff, and students at the University of Minnesota. We call upon our neighbors in the university community and the good people of the state of Minnesota to acknowledge and reflect upon the fact that the University of Minnesota stands on Minnesota Makoce, the homelands of the Dakota Oyate. Our Dakota hosts invite us to say Minnesota Makoce, to acknowledge the Dakota Oyate's sovereignty and their spiritual ownership of this homeland, their place of origin. I will turn it over now to George Dalbo, who will introduce the program and our speakers. And I want to thank you again for being with us today, for sharing. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. George.
Thank you, Alejandro. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome both Karine and Darlene this evening, as well as all of the attendees. Just for a rundown of our schedule for this evening, after briefly introducing Karine, she'll speak, and then I'll introduce Darlene as we transition, and then she'll speak, and we will have time for a question and answer session at the close of tonight's program. And so feel free throughout the presentation to add questions into the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and hope to bring some of those questions into a discussion at the end. So to briefly introduce Karine Duhamel, Karine Duhamel is Anishinaabe-Métis and holds a Bachelor of Arts from Mount Allison University, a Bachelor of Education from Lakeland University, and a master's degree and Doctorate of Philosophy from the University of Manitoba. Dr. Duhamel was formerly adjunct professor at the University of Winnipeg, where she developed and taught courses on the history and legacy of residential schools. And Director of Research for Jerk Law Corporation, conducting research on a number of cases related to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. Most recently, Dr. Duhamel was Director of Research for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, drafting the final report, as well as managing the Forensic Document Review Project and the Legacy Archive. She is now a curator at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, working across teams to develop and to deliver superior content, programming, and visitor experience. Dr. Duhamel is a member of the Board of Directors for the International Council of Museums, a board member for the Facing History Board of Scholars, a speaker for the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, and co-chair of the expert group on Indigenous matters for the International Council of Archives. And we are so thrilled to have her join us this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Duhamel.
Thanks so much for the very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here this evening. I'm at the museum now, but tonight I'm going to talk to you about a couple of different projects that I've been working on. And it's very timely because I've been working on, in the last few weeks, working on the National Action Plan, which comes out of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And it's really given me an opportunity to reflect on the work that we did, particularly in terms of education and some of the work that we did around trying to promote a new kind of education with regard to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And it is also reflected in some of the work that I'm currently doing for the museums. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share some slides with you this evening, only because you probably don't want to be looking at me the entire time. And so I'm going to do that right now. If you'll just be patient with me for one moment, I'm going to get that going. Okay, so here we are. And so I want to talk to you tonight about education as reparative justice. And I really want to talk about decolonizing approaches to Indigenous peoples. I talk about this from the perspective of research, but I'm also talking about it from the perspective of museums. I got involved in the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls kind of late in the game, so to speak. But there was a tremendous amount of opportunity to really think about what the impact of our work was going to be, what we wanted the legacy of the inquiry to be going forward after our mandate was complete. So for people that aren't familiar with the inquiry in Canada, just a very little bit of context for you. The National Inquiry was formed a few years ago in late 2016, and it was in part a response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, because they had heard from so many residential school survivors who also had a story related to missing or murdered Indigenous relatives. And so the inquiry came in part from the survivors, the residential school process, and also in large part through decades of advocacy on behalf of MMIWG families. The inquiry was mandated to look into a huge range of issues, including the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual violence. We were also charged with examining the very complex underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contribute to ongoing violence for Indigenous women and girls in Canada. And we also were directed by mandate to look into and report on existing institutional policies, including educational ones, to address violence, including those that were effective in reducing violence and increasing safety. We had a truth gathering process, and it was very powerful. In that process, we heard from almost 3,000 people on this issue, family members, survivors of violence, at 14 different community hearings, at 9 institutional and expert hearings. People could also testify through the form of a personal public declaration or a private declaration if they wished. That's when we would have a statement gatherer who was trained in this go to their homes where they were comfortable and take their statement and record their story. And notably, and for the first time ever in history, witnesses for the National Inquiry were allowed to share their truth via artistic expression. And so we received almost 1,000 different artistic expressions from MMIWG families that were about commemorating their loved one or about calling for justice in a context that's often denied justice. So as it relates to education, but also generally to the testimonies we heard, we really realized very quickly as part of this process how important it was for us to focus on education. The technology, or I want to say the structure of inquiries and commissions in Canada and elsewhere is that they're often really based on Western forms of knowing things, evidence, the rules of the process, the terms of reference. And we really, as a research and as an educational team, because the educational team was also part of the research team, we really wanted to think about how could we best sort of stretch this process to make it make space for Indigenous ways of knowing, because we were hearing so many important stories about how one of the big keys to addressing this issue was in fact education. So we looked as a research and as an educational team to counter the really dehumanizing impulse of looking at this issue purely from the perspective of Western research. It urged us to think about how society knows Indigenous women and girls, how it understands our families. We also chose to look at the issue of two-spirited people and the particular violence that they face. And so we really thought about how people understand Indigenous communities and families and Indigenous women. And what became really clear to us was that a lot of the education that the public receives comes from sources that are not ours. It comes from stereotypes, it comes from movies, it comes from tropes about Indigenous women. But what families shared about violence, about being targeted, was that these sources of information, in other words, the way that people knew us as Indigenous women, was as less than human. It was as a character in a movie and not as real people. And so it was also true that in the thousands of stories that we heard about these particular moments where relationships were formed, or when a person encountered a person, an institution, or an idea that ultimately led them to harm or to healing. And so looking through the framework of first the importance of teaching people about us as we are and not as we're sort of stereotyped. And secondly, the acknowledgement of the importance of these everyday encounters that for many of our families ended up being the worst situation that you can ever imagine, the very worst day of your life, were really important guideposts in thinking about what our approach to education looked like. We didn't necessarily have to do an educational guide, but we decided that thinking about what the families were telling us and the survivors were telling us that they wanted, which was for people to understand these stories, for people to have an awareness of the context in which Indigenous women and girls face violence every single day, that we really needed to create a tool for educators to be able to share these stories and to share this work. Now, I'm a historian by training, but I have always looked in my research to center the voices in the narratives and in the stories that I share. And I think it's partially because of the importance that I place on storytelling. So for me, part of the educational piece of this was also about going beyond MMIWG as a statistic or as a number. We often like to focus, I find, particularly in in the news media, on the number of people, but it's much less often that we're able to hear about Indigenous women or girls as dancers, as teachers, as healers, as storytellers, as powerful and sacred women who are targeted for violence in very particular ways. So the question that we really wanted to ask ourselves is, given these encounters and these everyday situations, how could we inspire people to transform the encounters? While governments and legislators were supposed to engage in this very difficult work, what work could we sort of create, or what work could we generate based on these testimonies for Canadian society, for teachers working with students, and for people who will ultimately carry the messages that the families shared with us beyond the end of our mandate, which was June 2019. So we created an education, a youth engagement guide, student and youth engagement guide called Their Voices Will Guide Us. And it's really that. It was an education initiative of the National Inquiry. Again, quite historic in its undertaking. And our intent was really to facilitate critical thinking, purposeful reflection, and dialogue around the perceptions and also the lived realities of Indigenous women and girls, including members of the Two-Spirited and trans community. The initiative was designed to engage students and teachers in really meaningful learning about the important roles of Indigenous women and girls in their families, communities, and nations, highlighting their strength, agency, and traditional responsibilities as Indigenous women and girls. It was also to engage students and teachers in examining the impact of these high levels of violence, the human cost and impact, and it really dovetails very well with the final report, which we called Reclaiming Power and Place, in identifying very important historical and contemporary tools that already exist within community, within storytelling, within traditional sources of resilience and of strength, in understanding this central idea that we worked with in the inquiry, which is the idea that our women and girls are sacred. It's very hard to underscore the extent to which the idea of our women and girls being sacred engaged us in our work, in everything that we did in research and in everything that we did in education. And I will show you some really neat examples of all of this work after. But the guide itself that I'm showing you here on this slide was intended to help learners understand how violence violates Indigenous women and girls' inherent treaty, constitutional, and human rights. And so we really wanted to position Indigenous women and girls as rights holders and insist that these rights have to be upheld for Indigenous women and girls to be able to reclaim their power and rightful place in society. We wanted to emphasize this notion that we all have a role and responsibility for ensuring that Indigenous women and girls are respected, valued, loved, and protected, and for recognizing their strength, agency, and leadership in a broader societal context of decolonization, transformative social justice, and also reconciliation. We considered it very important for all students to acquire foundational knowledge about the importance of Indigenous women's historical and contemporary roles, as well as ongoing roles in Canadian and society and in their own nations. We also judged it equally important for all Canadians to acknowledge and confront the epidemic of violence that Indigenous women and girls face every single day. So the guide is a very, very interesting sort of piece that contains lessons that I think on the whole look to bring these personal stories, to bring these women, to bring these girls up front. We wanted to be able to share with students the depths of loss that families and communities have suffered, and the importance of remembering and honoring, the lives and the memories of so many daughters, granddaughters, mothers, wives, partners, aunties, sisters, and cousins who no longer walk with us. This learning, we felt as a team, was key to fostering mutual respect, empathy, authentic dialogue, and action focused on our responsibilities as a society. And so the goal of this guide was really to engage students of all ages in generating, on a concrete level, arts-based messages of resilience, truth, hope, solidarity, and justice. And it was the intention that as a guide and as students did this work and as we were able to share some of it on our website and on our social media, that these messages could inspire and motivate Canadians from all walks of life at all ages and in all territories to take action in their own lives to generate a transformative social change. And so we gathered student messages based on the work in this guide, which came out before the inquiry ended. So it came out quite early on. and we curated them to form part of the final report where we look at some of these expressions. So for us, you know, hearing about these stories every day and hearing from the families, it was very easy to get discouraged and to get angry, right? And to get, to feel hopeless. But engaging in this work, in Their Voices Will Guide Us, was a really important part, I think, for many members of my team too, of continuing to be hopeful for change, continuing to push for truth and for knowledge, and continuing to believe in this idea that we could, through this process, though imperfect, have an impact on students and on Canadians at large. The guide was created in partnership, and it was led, and I have to mention her because she's so brilliant and amazing, by Charlene Barehead, who is a really amazing educator based in Alberta, Canada. She worked with a number of people who formed an education advisory circle from members from across Canada, specialists in education and in curriculum development. And in addition, we were guided by the voices of families and survivors, and also from our own National Family Advisory Circle, and also the National Inquiries Grandmothers and Elders Advisory Circle. So working with this team, and later with the research team as well, Charlene spearheaded this really important process that I think contains some really great things. So on that note, how the guide works, I think is really important. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just I think it's important to sort of lay out what we were thinking. So the guide has 5 main sections. So teachers start with background information and learning resources. As many educators in Canada, I know for sure, may not have the benefit of accurate information or education about Indigenous women and girls. So the section also includes information about preparing the environment for students and creating an ethical space for learning these difficult truths. So the section is intended to help teachers, guide teachers, in supporting students who may have experienced or are experiencing currently traumatic or challenging situations related to some of the issues contained in the guide. And so we really worked from a trauma-informed educational lens, where we wanted to consider not just learners as sort of blank slates of people coming to the table, but also consider that these are lessons that might be taught in communities, or to members of communities who live in urban centers, or to people who have experienced similar situations, and who are still sort of working through some of that. So that's sort of the first part of it. And then there's a number of different sections divided into sort of grade levels. So there's an early years section, which is really everything to grade 4. There's a middle years section, so grades 5 to 8. And then there's high school and beyond. And so the beyond is intended to talk or to speak to early years university or even adult learners who are wanting to engage in this issue. And so each of the main sections, the age sections, are further divided into important areas of focus that are central to each of the themes that are explored. And so essentially, the first piece is foundational learning. So for every age group, there's foundational learning. And then the second sort of section in every age group is inquiring minds. And I apologize for the error on my PowerPoint, which I've just seen. The third section in each of the age categories is finding their voices. And then finally, the fourth section in each sort of demographic is sharing the message and inspiring change. So the inquiring minds component of each section provides teachers with ideas on how to create this inquiry environment and critical thinking at different grade levels, because it's easy to think about critical thinking in terms of secondary students or adults. It's a lot harder to think about what critical thinking may look like for younger students. And so teachers do things like encourage students to consider their own roles and positions in examining truth and initiating positive change. They're also asked to consider the roles of others around them, and to also think of ways to engage them in constructive dialogue about accepting personal and collective responsibility. There are age-appropriate resources in the section to present ideas for teachers and for students about this. Then the Finding Their Voices section outlines the expected project outcome, which is for students to create messages of resilience, truth, hope, solidarity, and justice based on their learning and expressed in their own authentic voices. And so we've made suggestions for song, spoken word, dance, video, poetry, painting, sculpture, or any other artistic form of voice that students choose. And there are some really wonderful ideas there that are really focused on understanding the stories that are coming from families, that are coming from survivors, as a way of inspiring real empathy and real action-driven work. And so ultimately, this guide for us was really a call to action. And it's a call to action that's in there, and it says, we call upon you as leaders in our education systems to ensure that all teachers are provided with ongoing and authentic professional development opportunities that provide the pedagogical foundation and subject matter knowledge and skills to teach this truth with confidence, empathy, and respect. This will foster learning environments that create well-educated and socially responsible citizens for the future. That was one component of our educational strategy, but I also want to highlight another piece that we engaged in that I think is really important. Some of you may have seen this. This is just the most beautiful thing, and I just love it. This was part of our Be a Changemaker campaign, our Sacred MMIWG campaign, which was a social media campaign. Oh, sorry, my computer went a bit wonky there, which was a social media campaign that went viral. And we worked with Indigenous production company and photographers to work with different sort of either prominent Indigenous people or also MMIWG family members and survivors to create these beautiful images with different messages on them. And so you'll see on the slide, there is the idea of our women and girls are sacred. So there was a series of photos taken all across Canada with people holding that sign. There's also on the bottom, Ashley Collingbull, who some of you may know. And she took part in our Changemaker campaign. And so she's holding her sign saying, I'm a changemaker, are you? There are so many different images, and if you Google or look up on Twitter, I'm not very good with social media, Sacred MMIWG, you'll be able to see a lot of them. But this was part of the idea that even though we had created this student and youth engagement guide, we needed to go a little bit further, and we needed to engage all Canadians to think about Indigenous women and girls as people, and to think about their families, and to think about these stories, and to pay attention to the report and to the calls for justice that came out. Sacred MMIWG, I think, is an example of the need to reach beyond educating students to say, it is important to educate students for future generations, but it's also important to engage in public education right now. So now in my current job, which is the one that I had also for some time before I joined the inquiry, I do a lot of the same kind of work. I work at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights on the research and exhibition side of it. A lot of the work that I do focuses essentially on bringing the people back into these stories. So often when people are talking about atrocities or they're talking about genocide, they're talking about numbers, they're talking about sort of a mass of people, but they're not often talking about stories. And I think it's really important when we're engaging in educating students or when we're engaging in educating adults or the public, to really think about rehumanizing Indigenous people and thinking about the need to create empathy through personal stories and perspectives. So at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, we have several different principles that we use. They're also applied in the development of our educational tours. The first principle is the notion of community collaboration. So none of our content is generated by me alone as a researcher, even though I am an Indigenous person. When we are developing stories, I am working with the community or several members of the community to share that story. The second principle is the notion of prioritizing Indigenous perspectives and worldviews. And so we have a gallery at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights that's really devoted to setting a foundation for what Indigenous rights looks like in Indigenous terms. And it was developed in collaboration and in partnership with a number of different communities and individuals. And it's really part of preparing visitors to encounter the violations of Indigenous rights that come later on in the museum journey. And so it's based on the premise that people need to understand what is already there to understand the depth of loss that we present later on in the museum. The third principle is the notion of rights violations as shared history. So we really want for people who come who are from the non-Indigenous community or from other parts of Canada to understand that they have a role in this history and they have a part to play in addressing the legacy of it today. And finally, an emphasis on the power of change. And so at the museum, we always want for our guests, whether they're students or whether they're adults or members of the public, to leave the museum feeling as though they can do something. I do a lot of talking about human rights and Indigenous rights, and people always say to me, well, this is such a big issue. You know, how can I become involved? And what really strikes me and what I heard from family members during the inquiry, but what I hear from contributors to the museum all the time, is that if every person did one thing, just one thing, but if every single person did one thing, that would be a really amazing thing that would have great impact in the world. So we consider at the museum human rights education to be a lifelong process. And so we have variously themed programs, including workshops and tours, and we really strive to give students the tools that they need to think critically and with empathy. And so we have virtual tours, but we also have some really powerful school programs on site. One of those is called Telling Our Stories. It's for grades 4 to 6. And it uses primary source evidence, essentially oral history and testimony, to explore the truth and the legacy of the Indian residential school system in Canada. It aims to inspire students to act on reconciliation and to make positive changes in their own community. And we worked with a number of residential school survivors to create the resources for that. And so as the students go through the museum, they also have an iPad where they listen to parts of testimony from different contributors. And then they're able to sort of understand the importance of getting those testimonies from people. They're also able to really humanize people and to better understand the legacy of those experiences. There are a number of other tours. All of the other ones are also based on story, and they're based on this notion that it's really important for students to engage with survivors, to engage with communities in a way that's safe for communities and in a way that's safe for survivors. But that it's important to reach through the numbers and to reach through some of the big facts to really focus on these stories. All of these experiences, I think, you know, in some way in my life, I've always been involved in education. And all of these experiences that I've had, whether it's at the museum or at the inquiry have really taught me a lot. But more than anything, they've taught me about the importance and the power of relationships. I was doing a talk several months ago at Brock University on the national inquiry. And there was a young woman in the second row, and she was sitting there and listening to the talk. And at one point she started crying, and I was really worried about this young woman, because I knew that she had come in from her community to hear the talk. And so at the end, I sort of waited, and she did approach me. And she said to me, she said, I really appreciated your talk, and I appreciated what you said about, our women and girls being sacred. And, during my talk, I had shared some stories that had been shared with us from inquiry witnesses about these traditional stories in their communities about how powerful women were and how sacred that they were. And what the young woman said to me, she said, I'm very upset right now because I've just realized that I don't know any of my stories. I don't know those stories, and I want to know those stories. And so I think that was really powerful for me, because it made me realize that what we did with the National Inquiry, what we are doing with this guide, and I think that the work that I'm doing now at the museum is not about completing a project. It is about laying a foundation within which people are inspired to learn. They're inspired to seek information, whereby young women from communities are inspired to learn the community stories, whereby a non-Indigenous youth are inspired to better understand the context in which some of their classmates live, or some of the issues that they might be dealing with. It reminds me of the notion and the importance of centering relationships, not just in the research that I do, but also in learning and in talking about learning and teaching. We have a phrase in the Anishinaabe community, and I think it exists in lots of different communities in different forms. And we say, all my relations. And often in Ojibwe communities, you use this phrase in the context of a sharing circle or at the end of a prayer. And it represents an acknowledgement of the fact that we're all interconnected and of the respect that we hold for each other. All my relations are simple words, but the meaning that they carry is very significant. They represent the weight of the past and the possibility of the future, and I think that they carry with them important values that have helped Indigenous nations in building families and communities since time immemorial. I think that for me, all my relations points to the truth that we're all related. And I am talking here based on the work of Richard Wagamese, the idea that we're all connected, that we all belong to each other, and that this relationship means that we need to continue to grow and learn about each other. And so on that note, I want to say to you all, thank you, Miigwech, for joining us today. I think that engaging in critical dialogue about the past and about the future and about education and about educating children and about educating adults is really crucial. And I know in the context of the work that I'm doing now for the National Action Plan on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, these relationships, to me, the importance of these relationships are a really constant reminder of why we do this work and of the responsibility that's been entrusted in me by the family members and the survivors who came forward and who trusted us with these experiences. So Miigwech, thank you to you all for joining us tonight and for listening to me, hopefully not go on for more than my time. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to George to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Karine. I think It was, for me, listening, it's a rare moment, you know, where the technology seems to fall away, and, you know, it does feel like we're in the same room. And I certainly felt that way listening to you. And so I really appreciate that, and looking forward to a little bit of a discussion towards the end. But with that, I'd love to introduce Darlene St. Clair. And we're so thrilled to have her join us as well tonight. So Darlene St. Clair is an associate professor at St. Cloud State University, where she teaches American Indian Studies and directs the Multicultural Resource Center. Her work focuses on several areas, including Dakota studies, Native nations of Minnesota, and the integration of Native cultures, histories, and languages into curricula and educational institutions. She also studies the arts and cultural expressions of Native peoples. She is the director of the Minnesota Makoce, the Dakota Homelands curriculum, which was created to preserve and to transmit the rich historical and cultural heritage of Minnesota's Dakota people to the next generation. She is Bdewakantunwan Dakota and a citizen of the Lower Sioux Indian community of Minnesota. And so, Darlene, we're so thrilled to have you join us, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Mitakuye Ampetu kinde chante washte napetu zampie Iyekiyapiwin Darlene Washichu Darlene St. Clair Makiyapiye. Damakota chanshayapi hemataha wana chakpa ontue ed wati wana ikche wichasha wa unspe wichakia hemacha St. Cloud wonspe wakantunya and chtwani. Hello, my relatives. Today I greet you with a good-hearted handshake. I'm Iyekiyapiwin. My Dakota name is Iyekiyapiwin. My Washichu name is Darlene St. Clair. I am Dakota, and I'm from a place called Chanshayapi. Translates to "they paint the trees red," and it's where the Lower Sioux Reservation is located. So I'm originally from Lower Sioux. Now I'm living in the Twin Cities. I'm a teacher, teach Native Studies at St. Cloud State University. So I'm really happy for this invitation. I want to thank the Human Rights Lab and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, and also the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for sponsoring the talk tonight. I also want to thank Karine a lot for the work that she's doing. It's so important, and I can see a bit why we've been paired together, because I think we're kindred spirits on a similar kind of path. So let's talk about some of my work. So I'm doing this collaborative project with a Native nonprofit called Dakota Wiçoh'an. That translates to Dakota Way of Life. It's a regional nonprofit based in right off the reservation where I'm from originally. Our work is across tribal and colonial boundaries, with a focus on revitalizing Dakota language and lifeways. And so that work is sort of organized using these kinds of Dakota concepts of kiksuya, to remember, thinking about what we want to remember as Dakota people, to reclaim kiwashte. That is a reclamation both of Dakota language and lifeways, but also a relationship with our homelands, and kichiwashte, to reconnect, reconnecting those relationships both to ourselves as Dakota people, to our family, our larger community, and a reconnection to the land. So the work that I'm doing is really in collaboration with a Dakota nonprofit that focuses much of its work inner-focused, meaning that much of the work of this nonprofit is with and for Dakota people. But this is one project that they've engaged in that is more outward focusing, and I'll talk about that. So this is a curricular project, and it really is addressing ongoing erasure of Dakota experiences. So this is sort of experienced in general by Native people in the United States, that our experiences and our realities are absent from the contemporary consciousness of most Americans. That it's just Native people are not really, oh yes, there's Native people, that it is not in the public consciousness. If there is any existence of Native people in the general public consciousness, it is within a sort of colonial narrative. And that narrative being, a long time ago there were Indians, now they're all gone, so now everything here is ours. And if the average American does think about Native people, they have some sort of analysis that there's a tragic history, but with very little specifics. And so in Minnesota, most Minnesotans have a very limited understanding. And what happens with that limited understanding, and that limited understanding does not come accidentally, is that Dakota experience, Dakota people, Dakota desires, Dakota, the contemporary interests of Dakota people, that is easy to ignore, to forget, to minimize, or to really erase. And I think it is that ongoing erasure, meaning that this has been a long process, but the ongoing erasure is something that we're still facing. Now, as an educator, we're also thinking about issues of educational achievement. And in the United States, we have a way of measuring educational achievement. It's called the adjusted cohort graduation rate. So simply it means how many students graduate from high school in 4 years beginning in 9th grade. So it's really a measurement of graduation rates. And this is comparing across the nation and then looking at different racial groups. So the first year that this was sort of measured with comparison across the nation was in 2010, 2011. And at that time, Native students graduated at the bottom of all 50 states. We were the worst in the nation, graduating 42% of Native students graduating from high school within 4 years. Now, comparatively, if we were to look at white students in that same time frame, white students are graduating at a rate of 84%. So in Minnesota, we often sort of look to ourselves with a belief that we have a very strong education system. And the reality is we do have a strong education system for some students, and for other students, we are the worst. If we move on, we can see that the rates sort of fluctuate. And the most recent data that we have is 2016-2017 school year. And in that year, Minnesota was 51%, graduating 51%, with white students graduating at 88%. And I'd say we are second to the worst, because in this year, South Dakota is at the bottom with 50%, but we're right with them. And so South Dakota's stealing our thunder again with terrible graduation rates and racist monuments. So if we're thinking about educational equity, looking at both the ways that these systems don't work for Native students, oftentimes I'll have educators tell me, well, it's really those schools that are run by tribes. That's probably the problem. But the reality is, in Minnesota, the vast majority of Native students attend public schools. It's like 95-98% of students attend public schools. We have seen efforts to address educational achievement issues. However, those efforts tend to focus on the deficits or the needs of Native students. Some of these programs have been successful, and initiatives have come out of them that have been positive. I would also say, in the time that I've been an educator, there is a growing and increasing recognition of privileges and disadvantages within institutions like schools, and how that impacts educational achievement and educational equity. A lot of times when we have these kinds of conversations about educational equity in Minnesota, we're focusing on things like socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, and school funding inequities. And of course, those are all really relevant and important to consider. However, this curriculum is really coming at this problem in a very different way. It is recognizing that there is an underlying hegemonic understanding when it comes to educational initiatives regarding Native people, which is the assimilationist model for educating Native people is the only model. In fact, it's the only model that that the United States has tried. And in fact, the first mission schools in the early 1500s. So we've been trying the assimilationist model for hundreds of years with very similar bad results. The assimilationist model is sort of putting forward that in order for Native students to do better, Native students, Native families, and Native communities need to change. This is what I'm getting at when I refer to an assimilationist model. Rather, this curriculum, and I am positioning, that it is the disconsciousness and the positioning of non-Natives that continues to reinforce oppressive systems. That actually, it's not that Native people need to change in order to do better within colonial systems like educational systems. It's actually the positioning of settler society and the disconsciousness of non-Natives. And when I say disconsciousness, I want to explain what I mean, because I'm loving this way of thinking about it. We understand that we have there's a subconscious and an unconscious, but they're in a conscious part of our minds. Disconsciousness, in the way that I'm thinking of it, is a way that we know that that the knowledge is knowable. About Indigenous people and about the ways that settler society have impacted Indigenous people. That's known and knowable, but it is convenient that non-Native settler society chooses to sort of set aside that knowledge and sort of pretend as if it isn't important. It's the way that erasure happened in order to elevate the comfort of non-Native society. The way that non-Native society might prefer to sort of be in a position of innocence and not knowing the realities of Native experience. So this is about looking at the disconsciousness of non-Natives. So the curriculum is addressing this. The ignorance of Native experience is tied to colonial systems and settler privilege. And this contributes directly to the erasure of Indigenous people within the consciousness of settler communities and institutions. And this has been inscribed in curricula and enacted in pedagogy. So here's sort of like the underpinnings of what this curriculum is about. The intervention itself is curricular. It is called Minnesota Makoce, the Dakota homelands. Minnesota Makoce meaning mini water, Sota means the clouds are reflected or cloudy or cloud tinted or cloud colored. Makoce meaning land. So that's Minnesota Makoce. We translate to the land where the water reflects the skies. There are 10 lessons at sort of a minimum of 45 minutes. The goals of the curriculum is to center Dakota experiences and voices. Not the sidebar, but to center. To assert Minnesota Makoce as a Dakota place. To portray this history. The history of Minnesota Makoce is a shared history, although it's not experienced the same by settler and Indigenous. And to address the sense of invisibility experienced by many Native students and to be taught throughout the Minnesota Makoce region. And when I talk about Minnesota Makoce, I don't mean the colonial borders of the state of Minnesota. Minnesota Makoce is a concept that existed long before there was a Minnesota. Minnesota Makoce, in my estimation, and this could vary, it includes western Wisconsin, eastern North and South Dakota, into Canada, northern Iowa. It's a much larger area than the state of Minnesota. The curriculum is highlighting community voices, particularly of elders and youth. It is upholding oral ways of knowing and oral ways of learning and considering Wiçoh'an, or stories that are told, stories that are passed down, and then related to a prior oral history project that Dakota Wiçoh'an had done. It is looking at storytelling as a pedagogical tool and also thinking about sense of belonging. And in the curriculum, there's lots of research out about how sense of belonging impacts student success. Oftentimes that sense of belonging is referring to sort of a belonging to a community of other students, something like, or a school community. In this, when we're thinking about sense of belonging within the curriculum, I'm really thinking of sense of belonging to the land. It encourages students to see themselves as part of this story, both Indigenous and settler. And it provides a lens or a window for students to consider historical and contemporary Native experience. So this is not just a history curriculum, and it really isn't just talking about today. It's really talking about a very, very long and ongoing experience that Dakota people have within this landscape. So one of the things that makes this interesting and challenging in many ways for teachers is the very strong philosophical orientation. So this is a 6th grade social studies curriculum, and a lot of, as I've been training teachers in the region, many of them are recognizing that while there are certain sort of techniques that they've been taught in their teacher preparation programs, philosophy is maybe not quite where they have a lot of comfort. So there's a lot of addressing that in the trainings and in teacher support. But the curriculum itself has a very strong philosophical orientation. The first half of the curriculum is looking at traditional teachings, concepts, and orientations around worldview, values, this concept of Mitakuye Owas, which also, similar to what Karine was talking about, means all my relations, relationality, the land is a relative. And that these teachings would not be widely accessible outside of Dakota communities. In fact, we received teachings from Dakota community members in the curriculum. So just to sort of get a sense of what is in the curriculum, these are a few different lessons. So we have a lesson called Mitakuye Owas, our relative, the land. Mitakuye Owas teaches that humans are a relative of the land and of all things that exist on the land, in the air, and in the water. So this is sort of an essential understanding in this lesson, and it asks this question of students: how does viewing the land as your relative change your relationship to it? Another sort of snippet of the curriculum is looking at a lesson. We have a lesson called Dakota Wiçoh'an. Again, that means Dakota ways of life. And it's Dakota values in action. So within a Dakota worldview, it's important to live Dakota Wiçoh'an. And so this is a lesson where we're talking about traditional values, but not just talking about traditional Dakota values, but we're asking 6th grade students to consider their own stated values, their own family values, their own community values, and how do they use those values to make decisions. Another lesson towards the end of the curriculum, decolonizing Minnesota Makoce. So this is about reclaiming language and culture. So this is looking at more contemporary examples of Dakota people and how decolonizing is sort of maintaining and reaffirming that connection to the land. And then the last lesson is living together in Minnesota Makoce. So if we're all part of the story of Minnesota Makoce, we ask this question of 6th grade students: even if I'm not Dakota, how can I be a good relative in and with Minnesota Makoce? So this is sort of gives you a sense of really what the curriculum is about. Some of the features of the project is there is a required teacher training. In my experience, teachers in Minnesota and in this region have not been well prepared to teach Native content, and especially from this sort of worldview perspective. So there is a required teacher training. The other thing that we did is, as we developed the curriculum, we built a research project around it, and the research project has been completed, but we're currently still analyzing data. We believe that this curriculum is a living document, meaning it's never going to be done and it's never going to be perfect. And as more and more teachers implement the curriculum, we're looking for their sort of feedback to help us refine and improve. And we're also continuing to work in Dakota communities to add additional resources. The curriculum was developed with varied teacher comfort and expertise in mind, meaning that I have seen some teachers having really almost no experience and a very, very sort of shallow understanding of Native history, and feeling like I really need a lot of help in this. This is a real stretch for me. So we have a lot of support for those teachers. And for teachers who may have been working in this area for a while or worked with Native schools or with Native students, there's room for them as well. It's aligned with Minnesota state standards for social studies, and Northern Lights is the state social studies curriculum that focuses on state history, and it isn't here in Minnesota. It's 6th grade when you learn Minnesota state history. So many schools in Minnesota use this Northern Lights curriculum, and so we've aligned it to that. because we don't believe that our curriculum is something that will take the place of this state history, but that it sort of illuminates the existing state history in ways that Northern Lights would not have the capacity to do. So the focus of this is this shifting of paradigms. I'm thinking, how do we make this shift? How do we address the ongoing erasure of Dakota people and Dakota experiences? Once again, we're looking at those inequities, and I point to the disconsciousness of settler and settler-oriented institutions. Initiatives that have an assimilationist model will continue to have the same impacts they've had since 1500. They've not worked for Native people, and honestly, Native people haven't disappeared either. We see this as a system problem, not a student problem. And we need to educate to facilitate the shifting of paradigms of non-natives. And this is going to require change beyond content. It's not just changing content, it's also changing pedagogy. It's also about working on strained relationships between Native people and the American institution of education. And one of the most beautiful things is that Indigenous pedagogies have been meaningful for many different students. Many students for many students, the sort of standard educational system doesn't work for lots of students. And we have found and seen that those Indigenous pedagogies are meaningful to lots of different students. So this is just, some feedback from a student. So this is a 6th grade student wrote this in a journal. And I want to point out that this is not a Native student. This is somebody in the Twin Cities area. This project really reached out to me and made me feel more connected to Minnesota Makoce. I also feel as like I'm more connected to my culture and made me feel like I should value it more. I feel as if I'm also more united with the people around me, and I also feel like I should respect others' beliefs and culture differences. So it is this kind of, so while this is a curriculum that is talking about Dakota people and Dakota experience within their own homelands, we're also really asking for some really deep thinking among 6th grade students about their own sort of positions and their own connections, both to their cultures and communities, their connections to families, their connections to traditional teachings in their families and communities, and asking students to also envision what would it be like to be a kid in Minnesota Makoce if you saw the land as a relative. So in talking about reparation, I'm thinking about sort of reparation, repair, restore. How is this done, and how could this be done in a curricular intervention like Minnesota Makoce? What I see is I'm looking at the big picture as a scholar and as a Dakota person. I'm looking, the big picture for me is addressing that ongoing erasure and the ways that Dakota people have been erased from the public consciousness. I love you middle-agers, but the 6th graders is where I'm making the investment. I see that working with 6th graders as a long-term investment in our future citizenry. I think part of that work that's critical is the centering of othered narratives and othered narrators. I think I'm asking especially Settler Society to do some much deeper listening. I'm asking Settler Society to deal with your own crap, and that recognizing that some of that work is work that you own, that it is not Native people's responsibilities to fix for you. I'm asking, I'm seeing the ways that non-Native students and non-Native communities can learn from Dakota people, can learn from Dakota teachings without appropriating, and finding that new model. And understanding that those truer connections to Minnesota Makoce, it's good for Native people and it's good for the land. So when I think of the 6th grade social studies curriculum, it really is thinking about how do we make paradigm changes in this land with the citizenry, so that when these 6th graders are voting, are making policy, our teachers themselves, our parents themselves, that this is an investment in our shared future. Hanakja, Pinama Yapiye. I'm grateful to you all. I'm going to stop sharing And let's see what kinds of questions we get.
Thank you so much, Darlene. And yeah, I'm also very curious about questions, and so I would encourage people to add questions to the chat, and I'll try to bring those forward. And maybe while we're waiting for people to add a few questions, I could ask a few of my own. First, I mean, a very basic question that I think, you know, I would have for both of you is how widely do you see, you know, first thinking of Karine, the curriculum with the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and then Darlene, your curriculum, how widely has that been taken up, you know, both across Canada or in Manitoba and here in Minnesota?
I can go first. So what's been really interesting is I've been working with teachers, especially in Minnesota, for many, many years. And working with teachers to develop curriculum that address standards that reflect or refer to Native people of Minnesota. And I was so often told by teachers, if there was a curriculum that Native people presented that was well developed and it was a well-designed curriculum, then that would be the fix. That would be the thing that we're waiting for. And I have found that even now that the curriculum is out there and has been developed and is ready for people to use, I still get a lot of, sometimes districts, sometimes individual teachers, really holding back that this is something that is uncomfortable, I think, as it should be. And I am, of course, really heartened by how many districts have adopted it and have taken on the curriculum. But I also feel like this is not an obvious fix. I can't just put the curriculum out there and everyone understands and is willing to make the commitments necessary to make the impacts that we're looking for. It's kind of ongoing work.
Yeah, and I would say for Their Voices Will Guide Us, and also for the Sacred MMIWG campaign, one of the challenges of working in an inquiry or a commission is that you know that it's going to end, and you don't get a mandate to engage in education, right? Your mandate for handing in your report and doing your work sort of finishes. And that's really the challenge. And so it was like, that was why we said, okay, well, you know, while we still have a mandate, let's get out, let's create social media, let's get this guide out to as many people as possible, let's distribute it. And so I know that Charlene and her team did a lot of work, actually, like physically traveling around the country and showing the guide to people and introducing them to it. But I think that what's really great about it is that it's not sort of just Canada specific, and it can really be used in lots of different contexts to talk about this issue in lots of different places. In terms of how it's been taken up, I know we received a lot of different submissions during the inquiry from teachers who had engaged their classrooms in doing some of this work from Their Voices Will Guide Us. And just really quickly, by way of answering this question, I wanted to see if I could share something, but I maybe can't, so I'm going to try this really quick. But one of the really cool projects that we did, oh no, I don't want to do that, was a teacher who worked with her students to create essentially letters to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that they put into a blanket and then they had smudged. And so each person had to do sort of some research and look into the case and try to essentially like find fragments of person within a story that often focuses on, you know, where the person was or what they were doing or whatever. And it was a really sort of amazing project because it helped to rename people. And so there was a number of projects that were submitted as part of our evidence for the inquiry, but we're continuing to do work. And I know a lot of us that work on it are continuing to sort of share information as we can and share the guide as we can to try to get it out. I saw a question related in the chat about where it's available. So I'm just posting a link right now. I don't know if I can do it. Oh, yes, I can. For everyone, which is the link to all of the publications from MIWG. So it has Their Voices Will Guide Us, but it also has the report and some other documents that people might find of interest.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we'll make sure we send in a follow-up email as well. So wow, there are a number of questions coming in, and maybe just as I look through some of these, I would ask, both of you kind of touched on this idea of, well, maybe the way I want to ask this is, you know, how do you ensure in doing this work that that especially non-Indigenous folks, educators and others, aren't just sharing narratives of violence? And I think especially when we're talking about communities that have experienced so much historic and contemporary violence, you know, often I think there's a tendency to gravitate towards those stories of violence. And I wonder if you could speak to kind of your work in navigating some of that.
Darlene, did you want to go first, or do you want me to start this off? Okay. All right. Everything that we did for the inquiry, from Their Voices Will Guide Us to the final report, really came from a strength-based approach. We really wanted to underscore a lot of the stories and a lot of the knowledge that already exists in communities related to these really foundational ideas about strength and about sort of you know, Indigenous women and girls being sacred, and Indigenous women and girls being protectors and providers and warriors and healers, and all of these different and really important roles. So we were coming at it, you know, the entire project from a strength-based perspective. That doesn't mean that you don't talk about some of the really ugly and violent things that happens, but it does mean that you talk about it in a different way. And I really appreciated Darlene's explanation of the curriculum, because I think that in many ways it seems to me like it also is doing that, right, by drawing on the knowledge that exists in the community. And so for us to avoid sort of the pitfall of focusing only on victimization, or focusing only on statistics, or focusing only on these horrible stories, we really drew attention in the report and in the teaching resources to some of these strengths and to some of the stories that underline the very powerful things that already exist in community, that we don't need made up for us, they're already there, right? And so we really drew on many of those stories to guide us in our work.
Yeah, I mean, of course, in the curriculum, there is it is referencing colonization, so there's tons of violence in every way in that. And of course, the Northern Lights curriculum that is also going to be touching on that. I think the reason that we onboard the traditional teachings first is that we think that the understanding of the violence that Dakota people have experienced is going to be interpreted and felt differently by kids of by all sixth graders if they have some context of traditional teachings. So it's one thing to learn about treaty making, but if you learn treaty making without an intentional Dakota context, it has an intentional Western context of equal parties sitting at the table for a mutual beneficial agreement, and it's fair and it's legal. And if you then go back to, if you start with Dakota a relationship to the land, you really understand the sort of the violence of treaty making and the ways that it has traumatized ongoing still today Dakota people. So there's a reason that we put so much energy into those things, because the violence, especially in Minnesota, is something that is over discussed, I would say, with very little context among non-Native society of understanding Dakota people and Dakota worldview.
All right, thank you. Yeah, there are a number of questions about teacher training programs and work that could and should be done with not just practicing teachers, but pre-service teachers, and changes that should be made to the way in which, and I know Darlene, you mentioned this, right? Teachers are educated about some of these issues in Minnesota, but across the United States and Canada, I imagine more broadly. And so I wonder if you could speak to your thoughts on what should be happening in teacher education programs.
You know, that's such a long, that's another big commitment. And I'm in on that too as a university educator. But I do think that we have to really recognize that universities and the teacher training programs are another form of an American colonial institution, that it isn't necessarily that, you can't assume that it's that much better. I would say, as somebody who teaches Native studies, at least in my university, it is something that you can take if you're interested, but unlike places in Canada where some of these things are more, I don't know if is it required that you take a course on Canada, Indigenous Canada? I mean, I'm sure that there's a critique of that there as well, but it's like, this is light years from where we are in Minnesota, where learning about Indigenous people is sort of something you do if you make extra effort. And so of course, I think we have to look at a large overall of a P16 overhaul of the way Indigenous people are brought into the curriculum. And of course, specifically, I mean, I have done these Minnesota Makoce training with pre-service teachers. So it's possible that every teacher who's in college right now who wants to be a teacher, they can get trained and then they would leave with the capacity to teach the curriculum. So these things are made available. I think we're still in a growing phase in terms of reaching out because it's, you know, it's a big project. I've sort of not been able to read all of the questions in the chat. Hopefully I will be able to, maybe when this is over, because I don't want to let things get away. Yeah.
I'll echo that as well. There's quite a bit that's come through in the chat. And so hopefully if we can't get to everything tonight, you know, we'll apologize and find ways to kind of address those moving forward. I wonder, you know, so Karine, you mentioned in your talk this notion of everybody did just one thing, right? And, you know, kind of that would add up to a great collective of action towards kind of righting some of these wrongs. And I wonder, there are a few questions that kind of ask that. So what are some examples of those things that especially non-Indigenous folks could be doing, you know, and maybe teachers or, you know, non-educators, in terms of, you know, trying to make a difference in advancing some of this work?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I'm really lucky is I get to talk to people that do lots of different jobs from lots of different walks of life. And so, you know, I get this question sometimes from like the person that answers the phone at the front desk, and then I get it from a teacher, and then I'll get it from, you know, a researcher. And so I guess it really depends what you do. But I think that like what everybody can do is learn about this topic. And for me, it's really about getting to know where you are, understanding the land that you're on, understanding what it means to the people that were there before you, reaching out to find resources that come from those communities, that teach about the communities, not in a book that a non-Indigenous person wrote, but from the perspective of the communities themselves. So I really think that everybody can be a learner, and that's where everybody should start. And then they can build actions based on that. You know, there are some people that will attend a march or a demonstration or a vigil. There are people that, you know, will, you know, donate to an organization or go volunteer at an organization in their community. But there are countless ways to sort of get involved in an informed way and to be a good ally. And one of the things that we created in the report was sort of these calls for all Canadians, right? What can everybody do in Canada? You know, if you're not in government, if you're not writing the law, and if you're not making the policy. And one of the things we said was, you know, learn about this topic, get to know your local community, understand the organizations in your community that are working to help Indigenous families and communities, and learn to be a good ally, which doesn't mean speaking for Indigenous communities or people, but it means standing with, right? And so for me, I think there's like 1,000 different ways. For teachers, I think really, you know, I would concur with Darlene that even here in Canada, in lots of schools, and I did teacher training in Canada because I used to be in the classroom, we don't have a very good foundation in Indigenous history. It's becoming mandatory and it's sort of taken off, but when I went to university to be a teacher in the early 2000s, there wasn't very much foundation there to for people to sort of latch onto. And so for teachers, I think, you know, it's a matter of being willing to become a learner again. And I know that teachers can be learners and are learners. And so for teachers, it's a matter of first, you know, understanding the issue yourself, and then finding creative ways and age-appropriate ways to engage the students in that, which looks different for different students, right? But is findable, and the information is out there. It's just like often people won't go there because it seems like it's really hard or it's really inaccessible. But that's the thing about the knowledge that comes from a philosophical base or that comes from communities, is that it is accessible and it's out there. And the same person could hear a story, 5 different people could hear the same story, and they'll take something that's for them from that story. So it's just about really listening for me.
You're muted.
I think we might have time for just a question or two more. This has just been a fascinating discussion. I wonder, there are a couple of questions about land, and maybe this is for Darlene more, this idea of, you know, teachers, especially non-Indigenous teachers, perhaps, who are so disconnected or feel so disconnected, perhaps in their classrooms, from land, and helping students understand perhaps a different connection to land than they're typically used to. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that is a big part of the curriculum. A big goal of the curriculum is to build that relationship, that 6th grade students have an understanding that essentially they can look at the world through this Dakota lens of land as a relative. And for 6th graders, so many of them, that makes sense to them. They don't have to have, you know, seen the Grand Canyon to say that they have a relationship to the land. We ask them about places that are special to them, and it might be a park or a walk they go on with their parents or a tree in their yard. And these are the kinds of things that we sort of tap into, like naturally the connection that if nurtured, there is already 6th graders have a connection to the land, and we're just nurturing that and asking them to consider that as a way to see the world. And so it is really beautiful. And of course, as we know, some struggle more with that. But typically the idea of we're just nurturing kind of what 6th graders already have. And yeah, it's really lovely. And to see them start to connect those dots is really inspiring.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'm just looking at the time, and I think just one more question. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on, you know, both of you have been doing this work for a little while now, and kind of maybe the current state of where we're at in terms of Indigenous representation in education. And if you could just say a few things about kind of our current state.
I can start and I'll keep it short. I guess in Canada, there's been sort of a shift in the past several years, because we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was focused on the experiences of Indigenous people at residential and day schools. And so that really started, I think, a broader national conversation about what we're teaching in our schools, and sort of whose history is being taught, and all of those sort of bigger, deeper conversations. So there's been a considerable amount of very positive developments, I would say, in the curriculum in Canada as it relates to residential schools, but that has not extended to the broader history of colonization, I don't think. In any of the material that I've seen coming home with my 5th grader and my 4th grader, right? So we still have a long way to go. And I think a lot of people in Canada, you know, if asked about colonization, would say, oh, yeah, residential schools. But they wouldn't be able to identify land, staff, they wouldn't be able to identify treaties, they wouldn't be able to identify the Indian Act, which we still have as part of this broader story of colonization. So I think, you know, baby steps, but, you know, there's a need now to go to the next level and to really talk about this in a much broader way than I think that we're doing right now.
Yeah, well, we haven't had the national conversation. And I think looking at my Canadian relatives, I'm also learning a lot from their experience that the national conversation does not fix things necessarily. And especially if the national conversation is just that, talk, where actually settler society is not asked to shift or to make space or to give up or to open up. When those things, when it is just talk, then I think, so I mean, of course, I'd love to have the national conversation, but I do fear that it would follow a similar path as it has in a lot of other settler colonial nation states, is that Indigenous people have to be continually on it and reminding and fighting and pointing out the ways that we sort of keep falling into the settler colonial sort of trap. So I'd love to have the national conversation. That would be a start for us in Minnesota, Makoce. But yeah, there's a lot to do, but I think there's so many wonderful, creative, smart, engaging Indigenous people, not just in Minnesota, not just in Canada, but worldwide. And so really elevating those voices and working in collaboration. I mean, I'm optimistic for the future as well.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been just a fantastic conversation and really enlightening. And thank you so much for the powerful work that you're sharing and with us this evening. And maybe Alejandro has a few words to close as well.
Well, I just want to add my heartfelt thank you for such thought-provoking and informative presentations, and we're really thrilled that we could provide this platform and for sharing. And I would just echo, sorry, what Karine mentioned, that the task is not necessarily to, I mean, it's an impossible task to complete the project, right? It is more of laying a foundation and of this being an ongoing work. So I think your work is definitely laying very important foundations, and from our side, we modestly try to contribute to reversing that this consciousness, to combating that erasure with the programs that we do in collaboration with you, Darlene, since 2013, and we're grateful for that. And we also look forward to continuing working with Karine as we continue these dialogues, these conversations on what reparation looks like in our state and here in Sota and in Manitoba, and more largely in the settler colonial context. So with that, I would leave it there. Thank you, George, for capturing all these very good and interesting questions, and we left some out because of lack of time. I want to thank the participants for posing those questions, and we'll hope to continue addressing them in our next programs. So thank you all, and yeah, thank you, and have a great evening.
Have a great evening.